Today is Wednesday, April 8th, 3 p.m. Miami time, and I'm here with Beatriz Colomina. Beatriz, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to speak with me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to talk to you.
So, Beatriz, tell us where you are now and how the recent events surrounding the COVID-19 virus have affected the structure of your life and your work.
Okay, so I'm in New York City, so a very hot place to be right now. Of course, we are all shelter in place. So this is my loft in New York, in Soho, where I live and I work. I normally teach in Princeton University, and now we are continuing in terms of work my classes by Zoom. And also several lectures also around the world have been done in this medium. But in many ways, what is happening right now is the kind of obsessions that I have always had. I have always been preoccupied with this relationship between architecture and illness. And in particular, the question of tuberculosis and modern architecture has been very much the focus of my research that became realized in my recent book, X-ray Architecture, and also from another trauma in another historical moment, what we know as modern architecture emerged. So it's fascinating to think about what is happening in our times, in these times in which we are all somehow shelter in place. And as I say, these questions of privacy, domesticity, illnesses have always been at the forefront of my thinking. So it's not something new for me. It's just kind of living in a moment that I never imagined. I mean, actually this fall, for example, at Princeton, I was teaching a class on architecture and pandemics, thinking about with my students, not just about tuberculosis, but about cholera, about AIDS in New York and how AIDS transformed New York. So I suppose next time I teach this class, we will have to do COVID-19 and the way it changed our lives and our architecture as well. Yeah.
Having had an extensive interest, as you said, in the relationship between city and illness, but perhaps not having lived through those experiences that you're writing about, has this recent experience even changed the way that you've thought about your previous research or the way you might think about it moving forward, given that, you know, we've been sort of in confinement for the last 2.5 or 3 weeks?
Yes, but somehow I cannot explain that to you, but it never felt to me, unlike other projects, something distant from me. It was actually quite felt, despite the fact that I do not have direct experiences with illnesses, with serious illness of any kind, but it was an obsession that I have had since my childhood, probably. So probably the obsessions of another generation are living in me in some way, the generation that may have, that lived through the trauma of tuberculosis to a certain extent, because as you know, the first antibiotic effective against tuberculosis was not discovered until 1943, and it yet took some more years to become fully available. So all the generation of our parents, of course, lived through this trauma, and in many ways the cure, because there was no medicine against it, was architecture, was to take the sun, to take the air, to be outside. And modern architecture with its white buildings detached from the ground, where, as Le Corbusier says, the seas breathe, and he argues about cutting the ancient city of Paris because, as he says, historical Paris is tubercular Paris. So it's very, very clear the connection that modern architects made between disease and illness. For some reason that I cannot explain, I always live that in my own kind of psyche. So it's right now I feel like what has always been an obsession of mine is a reality in my life. but I wouldn't say it's a complete separation. I had imagined myself many times living in sanatoriums in Davos. In fact, all my research on tuberculosis and modern architecture is not just looking and reading. So how much architects make reference, and everybody has tried to repress that, to disease, to tuberculosis, to all the problems of health in the 20th century, and how they presented this modern architecture as a form of prevention and of cure against tuberculosis, but also through literature. I started this project the first year I arrived in New York, and I was a visiting scholar in a place called the New York Institute for the Humanities, where there were people like, for example, Susan Sontag, who had just written her little book, Illness as Metaphor. And it made enormous impact on me, and I start seeing modern architecture from that point of view, but also reading a lot of novels like Thomas Mann and all these great novels of the Robert Musil and all these great novels, and seeing how people live through that that period. So I have this understanding also of disease and architecture from other forms of culture, not just architecture.
Beatriz, maybe this would be a good segue into the second question, which is, given all of your research and your thinking and your own interest on this topic, what impact do you believe that these recent events associated with the latest of these pandemics will have on the world of architecture, or perhaps on the future design of cities, if any?
Right. Well, it's very interesting. It's always very difficult to predict the future, and in many ways, it will depend on how long this goes on for, how long it takes to find an effective vaccine, an effective medicine against the disease. There are very significant diseases, like, for example, the pandemic, the flu of 1918. That did not have significant impact on architecture, but let's say that they will be, right? And it's already having an impact on us, because here we are all living at home. I will say, if we limit it to tuberculosis and COVID-19, or even if you want, we can start with cholera. Cholera had an enormous impact on our cities, right? All the infrastructure of all the sanitation that was put in place when it was discovered that cholera was transmitted through water that was contaminated in that well in London, etc., that gave rise in many ways to our modern cities. Tuberculosis, on the other hand, was not an urban problem as much as a house problem. All the doctors will say that tuberculosis is a house problem. And so much so that nurses and doctors were recommending patients that were discharged from sanatoriums that they should whitewash their walls, open the windows, get rid of the carpets and the curtains because they accumulate dust. And it was believed that the tuberculosis bacillus was hiding in this. It was in the dust, and it was hiding in all these things that were part of the 19th century interior. So all of a sudden, the 19th century interior is demonized, not because we don't like it, but because it's unhealthy. And white walls, terraces, open windows, ventilation, even pilotis are prescribed as a way to cure or even prevent tuberculosis. So it's really a domestic issue. Now we are in a very different situation because the enemy is outside. The enemy is outside the house, and we are all confined in our quarantine spaces, in our apartments, and the enemy is in the street, in the stores, in public transportation, in public space, right? So in many ways you can say this is a reversal of the tuberculosis. The way in which architecture handled this problem of tuberculosis was in many ways gave form to this protocol that was already in place in doctors and nurses. Visiting nurses will recommend that you basically modernize your interior. Get rid of all this bric-a-brac. Get rid of your carpets. Open the windows. Have a simple metal bed. And all of a sudden, we have architects adopting this protocol and giving it form in architecture. So my thesis is that modern architecture emerged out of this big crisis. And of course, I think that if this continues for a while, if it lives with us, I hope it doesn't, it will also have an effect on our understanding of architecture and the way we live and the way we work. We are already conducting an extraordinary experiment of teaching at a distance. Nowhere we would have been convinced to do this under normal conditions. The technology was already here. We have done Zoom meetings before when somebody was away or we couldn't get to a certain place because there was a snowstorm. But only now we are conducting an incredible experiment with millions of people working away from their typical places of work, whether it's the university or the office, and working basically from our interiors or even from our beds, right?
Actually, in hearing you speak, maybe this is a follow-up question. I was just curious because having now lived and worked at home for the last 3 weeks, like you and most of the world, I wonder if this might call into question the hegemony of the open plan as proposed by Le Corbusier. I'm curious because I find myself compartmentalizing my own interior, right? Feeling the need for privacy as opposed to the expansive openness proposed by modernist architecture. I'm wondering if you think, given what you said earlier about the reversal, whether this might call into question the basic tenets of modern planning or modern plan making, let's say.
Possibly, I'm not sure. People are living now in such different ways than at that time. Even the basic unit, or what was considered the basic unit of the family, is in question, right? So many different forms of living are taking place today. If you talk about places like New York, what have been really incredible or transformative in the last few years, the realization that so many people prefer to live in a very, very small apartment and having some sort of communal life, almost like a replay of the 20s ideas of Russian constructivism and of modern architecture. Many young people in New York have an apartment that basically is a bed. You just open the door and you have a bed with a kind of some equipment. And there is a lot of common spaces for cooking, for eating, for exercising, for socializing, the terrace, the pool, the this and that. So they are now new typologies of living. How is this going to work in this age of COVID-19 is a different question, because now so all of a sudden all those people are confined in a very small apartment, working basically from their bed, and these social spaces are, of course, you have to be careful there too. You have to practice what they call now social distancing, right? So it's hard to be very social under these conditions.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Beatriz, for taking a few minutes to speak with me today. I look forward to a continued conversation, and I hope that you and your family are safe and well during these times.
Same for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.